Buddha nature, the Buddha never mentioned it. A concept that many modern people find very hard to accept is that their minds have defilements. They think that their minds are perfectly fine with nothing dirty or defiling in them. People can be especially sensitive about this issue because they grew up with the idea of original sin, that they were somehow inherently bad through no fault of their own. And now they've heard that Buddhism teaches that we're inherently good, that we all have Buddha nature. This is why they come to Buddhism, so they don't want to hear about defilement. They want to hear about their inherently pure Buddha nature. Well, even though there are types of Buddhism that teach about Buddha nature, the Buddha himself never said anything about it. In fact, he never talked about the innate nature of the mind at all. And two, the fact that the mind has defilements doesn't mean that we're necessarily good or bad or anything. It's just a recognition that some states of mind obscure our awareness. They obscure the clarity, the brightness that can be found in the mind. The problem is that we tend to identify with a lot of them. We identify ourselves with our greed, our aversion, our delusions. We identify with our defilements, but we don't like to recognize them as such. We speak of them in other ways. This is my identity, we say. This is my inner nature, my background. This is the way I've been brought up. This is how I've learned how to function in the world. These are the attitudes people have. There's a passage in one of Ajahn Mahabuddha's Dhamma talks where he's saying to the monks, "Suppose the Buddha were able to see your defilements. Don't you think he'd be disgusted?" I've heard people react to that, saying that the Buddha wouldn't be disgusted with us. The Buddha would love us. He would be compassionate toward us. To say that is really to define yourself very intensely with your defilements. Our attitude is, love me, love my defilements. But it's because the Buddha has compassion for us that he points out that the mind has defilements and that they can be removed. That's the important point. The fact that there's a defilement doesn't mean there's a permanent stain on the mind. It's not like grape juice or blood stains you can't wash out. But always recognize that these things do cause suffering, and they certainly do obscure the mind. If we want real peace and happiness, we really have to let them go. It's useful to see these things not as things in the mind, but as actions, as habits. Greed is an habitual action. So is anger. So is delusion. These are the ways we deal with the world, react to the world, shape the world. And we've gotten some results through them, which is why we tend to hold on to them, to keep falling back on them. These are part of our repertoire of tools, but they're pretty shoddy tools, and they do a very crude and clumsy job. I mean, you read about human history, and you see in each generation that there were so many good things that could have been done that weren't done because of people's greed, anger, and delusion. It's amazing that the human race has gotten as far as it has. Some people think that it's because of greed that we have progress. But you see what happens when greed gets unbridled. The economy turns into a huge casino, and the things that could be done with the wealth of the country just get frittered away. The same with anger. Think of all the money that's spent for armies' munitions, all the intelligence devoted to creating weapons to kill instead of being devoted to solve the genuine problems in life. It's all a waste. Again, it's amazing that the human race has gotten as far as it has. Delusion is even worse. It prevents us from seeing the harm caused by these qualities in the mind. A case in point is when we look back at our upbringing. We come to Buddhism from other traditions, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, and a lot of attitudes get buried deep in the mind from these traditions. Or we may be coming from a modern Western scientific attitude, a materialist attitude, and something deep down inside us insists that Buddhism bend itself in order to meet what we think is right or wrong. Or we feel that we're abandoning our identity, we're abandoning our background, our family, if we adopt Buddhist beliefs. All of that is thinking of our identity as a thing that can't really be changed. And this is precisely where the Buddha says, no. Your identity is made up of clinging aggregates. The clinging itself is an action. The aggregates are actions. Each of the aggregates is defined by an activity. Form deforms, in other words, it keeps changing. Feelings feel perceptions, perceive fabrications, fabricate the other aggregates into actual aggregates, and consciousness cognizes. These things are defined by their activity, and these activities are the raw materials from which we create our sense of self. In our delusion, we tend to think of self as a thing we're stuck with either for metaphysical reasons or for social reasons. But that's not the case. Selfing is something we do. We pick up habits from our environment. We pick up ideas from our environment largely in the course of our quest for happiness, our quest for pleasure. We find that certain things are under our control and there are certain things that we want, and we define ourselves around the we that controls and the we that wants or wants to experience certain things. These are called self as producer and self as consumer. And each of us, even though we may have been brought up in the same environment as our siblings, find that we have very different senses of who we are, who they are. So it's not the case that we're irrevocably formed by our environment. It's through our interaction with our environment that we create our sense of what's possible, what we can do, what we want, what's worth wanting. Some of that's picked up willy-nilly from the outside, but a lot of it's there because we let our greed, aversion, and delusion do the choosing. If you've ever been a parent, you realize that there's only so much you can force on your child. And yet when we look at ourselves, we feel that our parents had a huge influence this way or that, but actually we were the ones doing a lot of the choosing. So the question is, did we make good choices? If we didn't, we can always change them. When you see the act of identification simply as that, as an act, and your many different identities are different patterns of actions, different strategies, then you can begin to ask yourself, which of these strategies provide good results and which ones muddy things up? Which of the motivations behind these strategies are clear and clean in the sense that they harm nobody? They don't harm you. They don't harm anybody else. And what kind of pleasures are clear and clean in the sense that they don't get you intoxicated and blinded? If you have a pleasure that you really enjoy, and yet it causes harm to other people, you tend to deny the fact that it causes harm. You blind yourself. This is why it's important to adopt the Buddha's point of view of looking at the mind as a bundle of actions. It's not a thing. It's just lots of different actions, lots of different strategies. Some of them keep the mind obscure, darkened from what it could be. When the Buddha points this out to us, it's not because he wants to criticize us. If he's disgusted with our defilements, it's because he learned how to be disgusted with his own, having a very strong sense of how long he'd been under their power and giving in to them. He had identified himself with them and then came to realize all the damage that was done. So he'd had enough. You know the word nibbida, which we translate as disenchantment. It can also mean disgust. You've been feeding on these things for who knows how long, and now you realize that it's just been causing a lot of damage. You thought you were getting good nourishment, but that was not the case. So you lose your desire to eat these things anymore. The Buddha, in his compassion, sees other people suffering from the same misunderstandings he used to have, and so he shows us that these are defilements. They do obscure what we could actually see in the mind if we'd only let ourselves let go of them, create better strategies, better habits in the mind, so that we wouldn't have to depend on these old clumsy ones. We can fashion better tools so we can throw the old shoddy ones away. This is an important step in the practice, and an important understanding. We really do benefit when we see our defilements as defilements. They really do defile the mind. But as I said, they don't put a permanent stain on the mind. The Buddha's image is of clouds in front of the sun. They darken it, but the clouds don't have to be there, and when they do leave, they don't leave a stain on the sun. It's because he wanted us to see the brightness that's possible when the mind is cleansed of these defilements. That was his compassion. So learn how to see these things his way. Look at aspects of what you may think of as yourself, your identity, the beliefs and other things you picked up from your environment, and ask yourself which ones are obscuring your awareness. You may have a sentimental attachment to some of them, a sense of nostalgia, but you can't let that get in the way of letting them go. You have to realize that they really do a lot of harm in the mind. Only when you recognize that fact can you be free from them, free from that harm. And the fact that some of the defilements are ones that you identify with more than others that you really hold on tight doesn't mean that they really are genuinely you or yours. They're simply habits that are more deeply entrenched. They're going to take a longer time to dig up. But the first step is learning how to see them as a problem that you really would be better off without them. Learn to see your denial of defilement as the primary defilement you've got to let go. Freedom from Buddha nature. What is the mind? The mind isn't is anything. Ajahn Chah. The mind is neither good nor evil, but it's what knows good and knows evil. It's what does good and does evil, and it's what lets go of good and lets go of evil. Ajahn Lee. A Brahmin once asked the Buddha, will all the world reach release, awakening, or half the world, or a third? But the Buddha didn't answer. Then Ananda, concerned that the wanderer might misconstrue the Buddha's silence, took the man aside and gave him an analogy. Imagine a fortress with a single gate. A wise gatekeeper would walk around the fortress and not see an opening in the wall big enough for even a cat to slip through. Because he's wise, he would realize that his knowledge didn't tell him how many people would come into the fortress, but it did tell him that whoever came into the fortress would have to come in through the gate. In the same way, the Buddha didn't focus on how many people would reach awakening, but he did know that anyone who reached awakening would have to follow the path he had found, abandoning the 5 hindrances, establishing the 4 frames of reference, and developing the 7 factors for awakening. What's striking about the Buddha's knowledge is the implied, if people want to gain awakening, they will have to follow this path, but the choice as to whether they want awakening is theirs. The Buddha's knowledge of the future didn't mean that the future was preordained for people are free to choose. They can take up a particular course of action and stick with it or not as they see fit. The Buddha thus based all his teaching on freedom of choice. As he said, if everything were predetermined by the past, there would be no point in teaching a path to awakening. The number of people who would reach awakening would already have been set a long time ago, and they would have no need for a path or a teacher. Those preordained to awaken would get there inevitably as a result of a long past action or an essential nature already built into the mind. Those preordained not to awaken wouldn't stand a chance. But these things are not preordained. No one is doomed never to awaken, but until you've had your first sight of the deathless at stream entry, neither is awakening assured. It's contingent on intentional actions chosen in each present moment. And even after stream entry, you're constantly faced with choices that will speed up final awakening or slow it down. Nibbana, of course, is independent and unconditioned. But the act of awakening to Nibbana depends on a path of practice that has to be willed. It happens only if you choose to give rise to its causes. This, as the Buddha noted, involves determining to do 4 things, not to neglect discernment to preserve truth, to develop relinquishment, and to train for peace. Assumptions about the mind. To stick with these 4 determinations, the mind has to make some assumptions about itself, its power to do the necessary work, and to receive the anticipated benefits. But one of the central features of the Buddha's strategy as a teacher was that even though his primary focus was on the mind, he nowhere defined what the mind is. As he said, if you define yourself, you limit yourself. So instead, he focused his assumptions on what the mind can do. To begin with, the mind can change quickly. Normally, a master of the apt simile, even the Buddha had to admit that he could find no adequate analogy for how quickly the mind can change. We might say that it can change in the twinkling of an eye, but it's actually faster than that. and it's capable of all sorts of things. Neither inherently good nor inherently bad, it can do a huge variety of good and bad actions. As the Buddha said, the mind is more variegated than the animal kingdom. Think of the many species of fish in the sea, birds in the sky, animals on the land and under the ground, whether extant or extinct. All of these species are products of minds, and the mind can take on a wider variety of forms than even that. This variety comes from the many different choices the mind makes under the influence of ignorance and defilement. But the mind doesn't always have to be defiled. Past karma is not entirely deterministic. Even though past karma shapes the range of options open to the mind in the present, it doesn't have to determine present karma, the intentions by which the mind chooses to fabricate actual experiences from among those options. Thus, present, karma can choose to continue creating the conditions for more ignorance or not, because present choices are what keep ignorance alive. Although no one, not even a Buddha, can trace back to when the defilement of ignorance first began, the continued existence of ignorance depends on conditions continually provided by unskillful karma. If these conditions are removed, ignorance will disband. This is why the Buddha said that the mind is luminous, stained with defilements that come and go. Taken out of context, this statement might be construed as implying that the mind is inherently awakened. But in context, the Buddha is simply saying that the mind once stained is not permanently stained. When the conditions for the stains are gone, the mind becomes luminous again. But this luminosity is not an awakened nature. As the Buddha states, this luminous mind can be developed. In the scheme of the Four Noble Truths, if something is to be developed, it's not the goal. It's part of the path to the goal. After this, luminosity has been developed in the advanced stages of concentration. It's abandoned once it has completed its work in helping to pierce through ignorance. The fact that the mind's own choices can pierce its own ignorance underlies the Buddha's most important assumption about the mind. It can be trained to awaken, to see the causes of ignorance, and to bring them to an end. The primary step in this training is the first determination not to neglect discernment. This phrase may sound strange. To what extent do we consciously neglect discernment? But it points to an important truth. Discernment is insight into how the mind fabricates its experiences. This process of fabrication is going on all the time, right before our eyes, even nearer than our eyes, and yet part of the mind chooses to ignore it. We tend to be more interested in the experiences that result from the fabrication, the physical, mental, and emotional states we want to savor and enjoy. It's like watching a play. We enjoy entering into the make-believe world on the stage and prefer to ignore the noises made by the backstage crew that would call the reality of that world into question. This ignorance is willed, which is why we need an act of the will to see through it, to discern the backstage machinations of the mind. Discernment thus has two sides: understanding and motivation. You have to understand the mind's fabrications as fabrications, looking less for the what that is, what they are, than for the how they happen as part of a causal process. And you have to be motivated to develop this discernment to see why you want it to influence the mind. Otherwise, it won't have the conditions to grow. The understanding comes down to the basic insight of the Buddha's awakening, seeing things as actions and events in a pattern of cause and effect. It also involves seeing how some actions are unskillful, leading to stress and suffering, while others are skillful, bringing stress to an end, and that we have the freedom to choose skillful actions or not. This understanding, which forms the basic framework of the Four Noble Truths, is called appropriate attention. The motivation to develop appropriate attention grows from combining goodwill with this understanding. You set your sights on a happiness totally harmless. You see that if you make unskillful choices, you're going to cause suffering. If you make skillful ones, you won't. This motivation thus combines goodwill with heedfulness, the quality that underlies every step on the path. In fact, heedfulness lies at the root of all skillful qualities in the mind. Thus, in encouraging people to awaken, the Buddha never assumed that their awakening would come from the innate goodness of their nature. He simply assumed something very blatant and ordinary, that people like pleasure and hate pain, and that they care about whether they can gain that pleasure and avoid that pain. It was a mark of his genius that he could see the potential for awakening in this very common desire. Building on discernment. When you stick with the understanding and motivation provided by this first determination, it sets in motion the other three. For instance, the determination to preserve the truth grows from seeing the mind's capacity to lie to itself about whether its actions are causing suffering. You want to be honest and vigilant in looking for and admitting suffering, even when you're attached to the actions that cause it. This truthfulness relates to the path in two stages. First, when looking for unskillful actions that keep you off the path. And then, as the path nears fruition, looking for the subtle levels of stress caused even by skillful elements of the path, such as right concentration, once they have done their work and need to be let go for the sake of full liberation. The determination to develop relinquishment can then build on this truthful assessment of what needs to be done. Relinquishment requires discernment as well, for not only do you need to see what's skillful and what's not, you also need to keep reminding yourself that you have the freedom to choose and to be adept at talking yourself into doing skillful things you're afraid of and abandoning unskillful actions you like. The determination to train for peace helps maintain your sense of direction in this process, for it reminds you that the only true happiness is peace of mind, and that you want to look for ever-increasing levels of peace as they become possible through the practice. This determination emulates the trait that the Buddha said was essential to his awakening, the unwillingness to rest content with lesser levels of stillness when higher levels could be attained. In this way, the stages of concentration, instead of becoming obstacles or dangers on the path, serve as stepping stones to greater sensitivity, and through that sensitivity to the ultimate peace where all passion, aversion, and delusion grow still. This peace thus grows from the simple choice to keep looking at the mind's fabrications as processes, as actions and results. But to fully achieve this peace, your discernment has to be directed not only at the mind's fabrication of the objects of its awareness, but also at its fabrications about itself and about the path it's creating. Your sense of who you are is a fabrication regardless of whether you see the mind as separate or interconnected, finite or infinite, good or bad. The path is also a fabrication, very subtle and sometimes seemingly effortless, but fabricated nonetheless. If these layers of inner fabrication aren't seen for what they are, if you regard them as innate or inevitable, they can't be deconstructed and full awakening can't occur. No innate nature. This is why the Buddha never advocated attributing an innate nature of any kind to the mind, good, bad, or Buddha. The idea of innate nature slipped into the Buddhist tradition in later centuries when the principle of freedom was forgotten. Past bad karma was seen as so totally deterministic that there seemed no way around it unless you assumed either an innate Buddha in the mind that could overpower it or an external Buddha who would save you from it. But when you understand the principle of freedom, that past karma doesn't totally shape the present, and that present karma can always be free to choose the skillful alternative, you realize that the idea of innate natures is unnecessary excess baggage on the path. And it bogs you down. If you assume that the mind is basically bad, you won't feel capable of following the path and will tend to look for outside help to do the work for you. If you assume that the mind is basically good, you'll feel capable, but will easily get complacent. This stands in the way of the heedfulness needed to get you on the path and to keep you there when the path creates states of relative peace and ease that seem so trustworthy and real. If you assume a Buddha nature, you not only risk complacency, but you also entangle yourself in metaphysical thorn patches. If something with an awakened nature can suffer, what good is it? How could something innately awakened become defiled? If your original Buddha nature became diluted, what's to prevent it from becoming diluted after it's reawakened? These points become especially important as you reach the subtle levels of fabrication on the more advanced stages of the path. If you're primed to look for innate natures, you'll tend to see innate natures especially when you reach the luminous, non-dual stages of concentration called themeless emptiness and undirected. You'll get stuck on whichever stage matches your assumptions about what your awakened nature is. But if you're primed to look for the process of fabrication, you'll see these stages as forms of fabrication, and this will enable you to deconstruct them to pacify them until you encounter the piece that's not fabricated at all. Exploring freedom. So instead of making assumptions about innate natures or inevitable outcomes, the Buddha advised exploring the possibility of freedom as it's immediately present each time you make a choice. Freedom is not a nature, and you don't find it by looking for your hidden innate nature. You find freedom by looking at where it's constantly showing itself in the fact that your present intentions are not totally conditioned by the past. You catch your first glimmer of it as a range of possibilities from which you can choose, and as your ability to act more skillfully, causing more pleasure and less pain than you ordinarily might. Your sense of this freedom grows as you explore and exercise it each time you choose the most skillful course of action heading in the direction of discernment, truthfulness, relinquishment, and peace. The choice to keep making skillful choices may require assumptions, but to keep the mind focused on the issue of fabrication, the Buddha saw that these assumptions are best kept to a bare minimum, that the mind wants happiness, that it can choose courses of actions that promote happiness or thwart it, that it can change its ways, and that it can train itself to achieve the ultimate happiness where all fabrications fall away. These assumptions are the Buddha's starter kit of skillful means to get you on the path of goodwill, heedfulness, and appropriate attention. As with any journey, you do best to take along only the bare essentials so that you don't weigh yourself down. This is especially true as you test the limits of freedom, for the closer you come to ultimate freedom, the more you find that things fall away. First, the nouns of natures and identities fall away as you focus on the verbs of action and choice. Then the verbs fall away too. When the Buddha was asked who or what he was, he didn't answer with a who or what. He said simply, awakened, a past participle of verb that has done its work. Similarly, when the suttas describe the awakening of an arahant, they say that his or her mind is released from fermentations. But when they describe how this release is experienced, they simply say, with release, there is the knowledge released. No comment on what is released. Not even as it's sometimes translated, it is released. There's no noun, no pronoun, just a past participle released. That's all, but it's enough.